So excited about this session today. We're going to talk a little bit about developing your leadership pipeline in your local church. How do you do that? It's a great article written by John Maxwell. In his statement, he said, everything rises and falls on what? On leadership. Todd Atkins says something very similar. I want to talk to you today about developing your leadership pipeline. And what does that look like? What does that look like for you to develop your leadership pipeline? We're going to talk about that. If you're reading about development of pipelines, the odds are likely probably that you hold a conviction. You're on this call, you're on this Zoom, pastors and leaders, that because your churches should be developing people. In fact, I think there was a research that was conducted that suggested that, I don't know, maybe I think 1,000 folks across the United States shows an overwhelming majority. They affirm that it's really important to be training and developing your leaders and your volunteers. Yet the same study shows, look at that, 30% of the churches actually have a plan. Do you have a plan to develop your staff members? They're suggesting 1 in 4 churches require leaders and volunteers to attend training. Something is going on. We need to dig a little deeper. What is going on with this? Churches are not alone in this disconnect. According to the Global Human Capital Trend, I think they found that leadership remains the number one talent issue facing organizations around the world. In fact, these responses, executives are saying all across the world, 86% of them, that this is urgent and critical. And so our call as a church and as church leaders is to provide our people with a map for their development, not just a menu of ministry opportunities, right? But a pathway. I want to talk with you about that today. What does that mean to develop a pathway for leadership? Our call as a church is to provide our people with a map for their development, not just a menu for ministry opportunities. So I'm excited about sharing some things with you today as it relates to this. So let's look at the text. Let's look at Ephesians 4:11 through 13. Read that with me. It says, and he gave some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some pastors and teachers for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come into what? Unity in faith, and to the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Conviction. Are you convicted for investing in leadership development? I feel a conviction that God's hope for the world is the local church. It's you. The local church is I think it's plan A. And there's no plan B. And so God I really believe that we are the agents of implementation at the local church. And so new believers, volunteers, lay leaders, church staff members, pastors are all called to what? Fulfill the Great Commission. Christians are not just to be disciples, but we ought to make disciples that are making disciples that are making disciples. So don't forget that God didn't just save us from something. He saved us for something. And so if you look at Ephesians, I believe it's found in 2 verse 8 and 9. Let's read that together. For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It's a gift of God, not by works so that one can boast. So I think what Paul is saying to the church in Ephesus here is that Verse 10 emphasizes that with this gift comes responsibility. We are God's workmanship, and He has planned things for each and every one of us to take part of. And so the work is important, not only to us, but to believers and church leaders. So Paul is laying this out, and I love it because it's a groundwork for leaders that's found in this Ephesians 4:11 through 13. A church is not just a community with a gifted pastor and staff, man. It's a community of gifted people. And so God has gifted your local church. And so these verses remind us as leaders that our work is development of God's people that are under our care. And I don't believe that anything is more important or sacred or more strategic in the kingdom of God than the responsibility to equip others to serve in ministry. And so God did not intend for us this church to just be a community with gifted pastors and staff members, but I think it's to be a community of gifted people. So we got to build an army, not just an audience. And so I love that Great Commission. He's called us in the same way. We must develop, not just do. We must make disciples, not just be disciples. We must build an army, not just be an audience. And so, with the majority of the church leaders indicating conviction, are you convicted tonight regarding the importance of this leadership development in your local church? It's missing. Why are there so few people doing it in our congregations all across the United States and perhaps in the Caribbean? Well, someone suggested that there potentially is 3 reasons that is the case. That, while we're a community of gifted people, we got to build an army. There are reasons why. Number one, I think we just don't know as pastors. I'm a local pastor here on the west side of Anderson. I don't have a lot of time. Number 2, or perhaps we don't have a framework, or we don't have resources. What are the barriers? Talk about it with yourselves. What are the barriers that's preventing you as a leader to raise up leaders in the nurture and admonition of the Lord that will make disciples, that will make disciples, that will make disciples? What is it? And so I want to talk about that. I don't know that a pastor knows how to train people in every ministry area. And so it's a struggle. So whenever I meet churches as I travel, I ask staff members to kind of compile a list of things that keep them from leadership development. And these barriers are certainly the ones that we see. And I think you should be able to resonate with these barriers, I think. So take a moment and note, what are the top 5 for you? There may not be any of the ones that I mentioned, but write on your notes, what are your top 5 barriers for leadership development? Tell us and talk about it briefly. So the good news is that you're not alone. I'm with you. The key difference between a church that's moving towards success and developing leaders and a pipeline is just not focusing on the barriers. It's focusing on the C's. And I think the C's would look like a clear conviction. You got to have a clear conviction. God has convicted me that we've got to develop leaders. I'm putting together relationships with the universities and connecting with them and putting together a pathway for leadership for my local church and for our 2,000 churches here in North America. Number 2, you got to have healthy culture that will lead to healthy construct. And you ask, what's construct? Systems are so important as we move the ball towards leadership, as we practice leadership placement, not just leadership development. Let me repeat that. Not just placing people, putting your hands, Timothy talks about not putting your hands on people too soon and too quickly. So when you practice leadership placement over leadership development, you play a dangerous game, I'm telling you. The author would suggest that you're likely putting people in positions beyond their level of competence, and so you're going to sacrifice some good fit for individual leaders, and so don't just settle for the warm body instead of just a weekly volunteer. I really believe that God has called us to consider the cost of bringing in someone from the outside and not just um, putting your hands on anyone. Because healthy churches practice leadership development, not leadership placement. Clear conviction that people development is at the core of what a church should do. And if you have a culture that is reasonably healthy, then you're then you the only thing that you may be missing now is construct, which is what I would call systems. What are your systems? What are your systems? Um, when you look at leadership pipeline, some folks look at it as linear. I would suggest to you that linear is a pipe dream. It's not linear. Right? It looks more like this. It's on to the next. You're moving on to the next. And as you're moving on to the next, you're learning and you're growing. And so this leadership pipeline, when you talk about systems, it's important to understand the construct and how that is developed. It's not a linear construction. Uh, Leadership pipeline presents both competencies at leadership levels and skills needed to transition from one level of leadership to the next. And so if you can look at the bottom diagram, you can see people transitioning from one level of leadership to the next. And you'll see that it's bent, it's multiple places. And in each one of those bends or passages, there's a change in the organizational position and a different level and maybe even a different complexity of leadership. And so there's a significant mind shift going from one to the next there. So you got to understand that system and that construction is not linear. It looks more like the bottom, not the top. A spiritual leader must be able to see the end result, says J. Oswald Sanders. Where are you going and where do you fit? Where are you going and where do you fit? Where are you going and where do you fit? And so these leadership passages are kind of lined with what core competencies, culture forming content, and role-based training. And so we've got to ensure that everyone knows where they're going and where each individual fits to make the steps that's easy and obvious and strategic. And so you got to communicate clearly, church family, the next steps. And that's really, really vital. Most training is like oftentimes just cruising nowhere. Yeah, it's just cruising nowhere. And so God, I think is saying in this season, we've got to move in a way that is intentional as we go forward with this leadership development. So where do we start? It begins with systems. Well, you know your systems. You can look to your right. There's the bottom portion. There's an ecosystem. To the right, there's a solar system. To the left, there is an ecosystem. God created systems. Are you developing systems that will outlast you? Good systems and quality people that are in the right position for ministry really makes the difference. Some of you may want to stop reading right now because you think that I'm going to introduce some sort of secular business. This is not a secular business strategy. In Romans, it talks about, the different parts of the body. These are systems. Think about how God created those systems. They're organizational systems. And I realize that about systems that your church is not the most exciting thing in the world, but nevertheless, you gotta put systems in place. Healthy systems will ensure your short-term and long-term success going forward. Systems are not ungodly. Get that out of your mind. You need systems. And these systems, I think, are going to show you the value as a church and the gaps between your actual and your aspirational values. You need systems. Not only do you need systems, you need organizational systems. These are healthy systems that will assure the long-term and short-term success of your church. And what systems does is, for the newcomer, for instance, what happens when I walk in the door of your church? Talk about it for a second with your neighbor. What are some of the systems that are active when you walk in the door? You've got an usher, you've got a greeter, um, you've got a worship system. You have a system that's it's helping with assimilation and follow-up. What are the systems? And if you don't, and if you have not identified the systems, you need to begin to do that intentionally, as God continues to take you to higher heights and deeper depths. If you haven't really implemented a leadership pipeline at your church, another thing that you've got to do is to determine where am I? You got to do an audit. An audit. This is a 5-step audit. These are the advantages of clarifying your systems and your pipeline. Number one, you got to identify the current systems that you have. What is the next step systems that you have right now? Number two, you need to provide systems that has clarity for development. What's your pathway to discipleship and development? You need to create pathways for growth and development, and enable a diagnosis of where and why your pipeline is kind of clogged up. You have a clogged up pipeline? What happens to me after I get baptized? What happens to me? People are getting lost in the sauce in the local church because you have not established a pipeline. It will align language and position and the overall ministry as you move forward. You need important systems. Content. Leadership development is a process that occurs in the context of relationship. So what's content? You're encouraging folks to read. You're encouraging them to go to college and get an education, the School of Theology, the doctrine. They've got to learn and grow in those areas. So you've got to have knowledge, but knowledge alone is not going to, that knowledge has to be applied. It has to be applied knowledge. And so it's important for you to establish a process for experience. There's a residency program, there's an internship program. And lastly, you got to have a coach. Each individual has to have a coach, so that you have someone that's pulling out of that individual what they need to move forward and grow in what God has called them to do. So you have to have a content that will help to develop your team. It's important. Churches are still looking because they transfer information and it doesn't lead to transformation. Leadership development is not a program. It's not an event. Leadership development is a process that occurs in the context of relationship. Somebody say relationship. Amen. I'm teaching now. And so you use the word competency because training that leads to competency it's about mastery, not knowledge transfer. And so when one shows competency, they kind of display this message of proficiency or mastery. So those three things I think are going to be important. It's like, going to get your license. There's a convergence that happens there. You got to pass a written test. I failed it twice. Don't feel too bad. You get your permit, then you go for the experience behind the wheel. That requires a permit. And then You get the experienced driver that helps you, and that experienced driver provides the coach that will help you to move along. And once you get that knowledge, then that experience and that coach element is really the one that helps you to get to the next level. Um, and you continue. I still coach my son in driving. So you need these three elements: knowledge, coaching, and experience. And many churches hand the ministry keys to individuals before they are really prepared to do ministry effectively because they're not ready. Don't hand over your car keys to someone who has never driven before. Isn't that crazy? I know it's sobering, but don't hand that off um, uh, because in church, an eternity is at stake. So it's important that we take those three processes into consideration. And so every church needs a leadership pipeline. Every person needs a training pathway. Um, why? Because you need to be able to lead yourself. How well are you leading yourself? How well are you leading others? How well are you leading leaders? How well are you leading your departments or you're leading the church? Um, you need a leadership pipeline. We do. And I'm praying for you as God continues to develop one. Here is a pathway at I'm working with leaders across our movement here in the United States. Take a picture of this because we're going to be using this to really move the ministry forward. Have you spoken to someone about ministry? This could be a young next gen person. If the answer is yes, then then you move to the next place. And the QR code is a place where you can actually capture that information. Have you spoken to your pastor about it? Take a close look at this resource. Take a picture of it if you'd like, because I think we're going to be using this here in the United States as we help our churches to get to the next level as it relates to leadership and development. So Todd Atkins writes about developing a leadership pipeline, and John Maxwell, on the 21 indispensable qualities of a leader. And that was my bibliography. That's where I received my resources um, and my sources to actually speak to you today. So leadership pipelines are important to you as a church. And God is saying in this season, we need to begin to prepare leaders. 8% of our churches are led by leaders that are under 40 here in the United States. I'm not sure what it is there in the Caribbean, but God has called us as churches to develop and not just a menu, right? But every church needs a leadership pipeline. Every person needs a training pathway. And the primary tool for delivery of both leadership pipeline and training pathways is making sure that you have systems in place to lead your next gen leaders to prepare a succession plan. And so I'm praying for you. I believe that God has a great plan for your local church. Everything rises and falls on leadership. And our call to you as a leader is to provide your people with a map for development, not just a menu, but a map. You need conviction to invest in the leadership that you have. You not only need conviction, but uh, you need construct. You need systems that will change your culture. We must build an army, not just an audience. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May His face shine upon you and give you peace as you begin this journey of developing a leadership pipeline. Blessings to you and your church.